The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the convoy of 3 black SUVs racing through the barren landscape. Inside the middle vehicle, Captain Sarah Chen sat quietly, her eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses, her expression unreadable. The other operatives in the convoy had been briefing each other on the mission parameters, but Sarah remained silent. She had learned long ago that talking before a mission only wasted energy she would need later. The mission seemed straightforward on paper. Intelligence had located a high-value target at a remote military installation deep in hostile territory. The target was a weapons dealer who had been supplying advanced technology to enemy forces for the past 2 years. Sarah's team was tasked with infiltration, data extraction, and, if possible, bringing the target back alive. Standard procedure for operatives of their caliber. What the briefing papers didn't mention was that Sarah had been fighting a severe infection for the past week. The medical team at headquarters had recommended she sit this one out, but Sarah refused. She had spent 6 months tracking this weapons dealer, building the intelligence network that finally pinpointed his location. This was her operation, and she would see it through. The convoy came to a stop 15 miles from the target location. This was as far as they could go without being detected by the base's surveillance systems. Sarah stepped out of the vehicle, her legs slightly unsteady. The fever had spiked again during the drive, but she forced herself to appear normal. Around her, the team of 12 operatives began unloading equipment and checking their gear. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, her second-in-command, approached her with a concerned expression. He had noticed her unusual quietness during the drive and the slight tremor in her hands. Marcus had worked with Sarah for 3 years and knew her better than most. He could tell something was wrong. Sarah waved off his concerns before he could voice them. They had a mission to complete, and personal weaknesses had no place in the field. The plan was simple. They would approach the base under cover of darkness, breach the perimeter at the weakest point, identified by satellite reconnaissance, locate the target in the command center, extract the necessary intelligence, and exfiltrate before dawn. They had a 4-hour window to complete the entire operation. As night fell, the team moved out. They traveled on foot, carrying over 60 pounds of equipment each. The terrain was unforgiving. All rocky slopes and loose sand that threatened to give way with every step. Sarah felt her body protesting with each mile they covered. The infection was spreading faster than she had anticipated, and the antibiotics she had been taking were barely keeping it in check. 2 hours into the march, they reached the observation point overlooking the base. Through night vision goggles, Sarah studied the facility. It was larger than the intelligence reports had indicated. What was supposed to be a small outpost looked more like a full military installation with at least 200 personnel. Guard towers dotted the perimeter. Patrol vehicles moved along the fence line at regular intervals. Marcus pulled up beside her and whistled low. This changed everything. Their 12-person team was equipped for a quick strike against a lightly defended position, not an assault on a fortified base. Sarah's mind raced through the options. They could abort and call for backup, but that would take days to arrange, and by then, the target would likely have moved. They could proceed with the original plan and hope the element of surprise would be enough. Or they could modify their approach entirely. Sarah made the decision. They would proceed, but with modifications. Instead of a direct breach, they would use a diversion. Half the team would create a distraction on the eastern side of the base, drawing the majority of the guards away from their true entry point on the western perimeter. It was risky, but it gave them a fighting chance. The team split into 2 groups. Marcus would lead the diversion team, while Sarah led the primary infiltration group. As they moved into position, Sarah felt another wave of fever wash over her. Her vision blurred momentarily, and she had to steady herself against a rock. One of her team members noticed and asked if she was all right. Sarah nodded curtly and kept moving. At exactly midnight, Marcus's team initiated the diversion. Explosions rocked the eastern section of the base, and alarms began blaring across the facility. Lights flooded the compound as hundreds of personnel rushed to respond to the apparent attack. Sarah watched through her scope as the guard towers on the western side emptied, the sentries running to reinforce the eastern defenses. This was their window. Sarah signaled her team forward. They moved quickly across the open ground, reaching the western fence in less than 2 minutes. The breaching charges were placed with precision and within seconds. They'd created an opening large enough to slip through. 5 operatives moved into the base-like shadows, Sarah leading from the front despite the fever that now had her sweating profusely in the cool night air. The command center was located in the central building, a 3-story concrete structure that stood taller than the surrounding barracks and warehouses. Intelligence indicated the target maintained an office on the top floor. Sarah's team moved through the chaos of the base, using the confusion from the diversion to their advantage. Soldiers ran past them without a second glance, assuming they were fellow personnel responding to the emergency. They reached the command center and encountered their first real obstacle. The building was locked down with armed guards at every entrance. Sarah's team would have to fight their way in, which would alert the entire base to their presence. Time was running out. The diversion wouldn't last much longer. Sarah made a split-second decision that would change everything. Instead of forcing entry through the guarded doors, she spotted a maintenance shaft on the side of the building. It was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but it led directly into the building's ventilation system. From there, he could access the upper floors without alerting the guards below. The problem was that someone had to go first, and Sarah's fever was now reaching dangerous levels. Her hands were shaking, and her vision kept fading in and out. But she was the smallest member of the team, and the only one who could fit through the tight access point. Without hesitation, she shed her tactical vest and most of her equipment, keeping only her sidearm and a small data extraction device. Her team watched in concern as their captain squeezed into the maintenance shaft. The metal walls pressed against her from all sides, and the heat inside was stifling. Sarah crawled forward, inch by agonizing inch, her breath coming in short gasps. The infection was taking its toll, and she could feel her strength fading with each movement. After what felt like an eternity, but was only about 10 minutes, Sarah reached the ventilation junction. She could see through the grates into the hallways of the command center. Guards patrolled below, unaware of her presence above them. She navigated through the ductwork until she reached the 3rd floor. Directly above the target's office, Sarah removed the ventilation grate as quietly as possible and lowered herself into a darkened storage room. She took a moment to catch her breath and check her weapon. Through the door, she could hear voices speaking in a foreign language and the sound of hurried footsteps. The base was still responding to the diversion, which meant she still had time. Moving like a ghost, Sarah made her way down the corridor toward the target's office. She passed several closed doors and finally reached the one marked with the nameplate she had memorized from the intelligence reports. Her hand hesitated on the door handle. Behind this door was the man responsible for countless deaths, the man who had been arming enemy forces with weapons that had killed her, fellow soldiers and innocent civilians. Sarah turned the handle and pushed the door open. The office was empty. Papers were scattered across the desk, and a computer screen glowed in the darkness, but there was no sign of the target. For a moment, Sarah felt her heart sink. Had he already fled? Had the diversion tipped him off? Then she heard it. A voice behind her, speaking in accented English. The target hadn't fled. He had been waiting. Sarah spun around to find herself facing not just the weapons dealer, but 4 armed guards, who had been concealed in the shadows of the hallway. She was trapped, outnumbered, and in no condition to fight her way out. The weapons dealer smiled coldly at her. He had known they were coming. The entire operation had been compromised from the start. The base wasn't lightly defended by accident. They had been expecting an assault team and had prepared accordingly. Sarah's hand moved toward her weapon, but she knew she wouldn't be fast enough. The guards had their rifles trained on her, fingers on triggers. What happened in the next few seconds would determine not just the outcome of the mission, but whether Sarah would survive the night. As her fever spiked to dangerous levels and armed enemies closed in around her, nobody expected her to survive. Nobody expected what would happen next. Sarah's training kicked in before her conscious mind could process the danger. She dropped to the floor as the first shots rang out, the bullets passing through the space where her head had been milliseconds before. Rolling behind the heavy wooden desk, She drew her sidearm and returned fire in one fluid motion. 2 of the guards went down before they could adjust their aim. The weapons dealer dove for cover, shouting orders in his native language. The remaining 2 guards spread out, trying to flank Sarah's position. She could hear more footsteps pounding down the corridor. Reinforcements were coming, and she was trapped in an office with limited ammunition and a body that was rapidly shutting down from the infection. Sarah's mind worked through the tactical situation. With crystal clarity, despite the fever clouding her thoughts, the office had one door, which was now blocked by hostile forces. There were windows, but they were on the 3rd floor, making escape that way nearly impossible. Her team was outside the building, unable to reach her without fighting through dozens of armed guards. She was on her own. The sound of breaking glass made her look up. One of the guards had circled around and was climbing through the window from an adjacent room. Sarah fired twice, and the guard tumbled backward with a scream. But the distraction cost her. The other guard had moved into position and opened fire. Sarah felt a burning sensation across her left shoulder as a bullet grazed her. The pain was sharp, but the adrenaline pumping through her system dulled it to a manageable level. She pressed her hand against the wound and felt warm blood seeping through her fingers. This was getting worse by the second. Her ammunition was running low. More guards were arriving every moment, and she was losing blood on top of fighting a severe infection. The logical part of her brain was telling her the situation was unsalvageable. But Sarah had never been one to accept impossible odds. The weapons dealer was hiding behind a filing cabinet near the door. Sarah could see his shadow reflected in the glass of a picture frame on the wall. He was on his radio, coordinating the response to her presence. If he succeeded in organizing the base's forces, she would be overwhelmed in minutes. She had to stop him now. Sarah grabbed a heavy paperweight from the desk and hurled it across the room. It smashed through the window, creating a loud crash and shower of glass. The remaining guard instinctively turned toward the sound, and in that split second of distraction, Sarah moved. She vaulted over the desk, firing as she ran. The guard took 2 rounds center mass and collapsed. Before the weapons dealer could react, Sarah was on him. She grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the wall, her pistol pressed firmly under his chin. He stared at her with a mixture of fear and defiance, his hand still clutching the radio. Sarah ripped it from his grasp and tossed it aside. The sound of boots thundering up the stairs told her that time was up. She had maybe 30 seconds before the building would be swarming with hostile forces. Sarah needed that intelligence data, and she needed it now. She released the dealer and moved to his computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard despite the tremor in her hands. The weapons dealer watched her with calculating eyes. He spoke softly, his English smooth and practiced. He told her it was too late. The files were encrypted with security she couldn't break. Even if she managed to extract the data, she would never make it out of the building alive. He suggested she surrender. Perhaps they could come to an arrangement. Sarah ignored him. Her fingers continued their work, inserting the data extraction device into the computer's port. The device was military-grade technology, designed to bypass most security systems. It began downloading files at an incredible rate, but it would still take precious minutes to complete. Minutes Sarah didn't have. The first wave of reinforcements reached the office door. Sarah could hear them stacking up outside, preparing to breach. She grabbed the weapons dealer and positioned him in front of the door, using him as a human shield. She called out that she had their commander hostage and would kill him if they entered. The footsteps outside hesitated. A voice called back in broken English, telling her to release the prisoner. They would allow her to leave unharmed if she cooperated. Sarah knew it was a lie. She had seen too much, knew too much. Even if they let her walk out of the building, she would never make it off the base alive. But the lie bought her a few more seconds. The data extraction device was now at 60% complete. The weapons dealer was talking again, trying to negotiate. He offered her money, more money than she would make in 10 lifetimes of military service. He could make her rich beyond her wildest dreams. All she had to do was destroy the extraction device and walk away. Sarah's response was to press the pistol harder against his spine, silencing him. 80%. The download was almost complete, but Sarah's body was reaching its breaking point. The fever was causing her vision to blur, and she could feel her grip on the pistol weakening. The bullet wound on her shoulder had soaked through her uniform, and she was starting to feel lightheaded from blood loss. She needed to stay conscious for just a few more minutes. The door exploded inward. Sarah had been expecting a slow breach, but they had used explosives. The blast threw her backward, and she lost her grip on both the weapons dealer and her pistol. Smoke filled the room as armed figures poured through the doorway. Sarah scrambled to her feet, her training the only thing keeping her moving despite her body's protests. She grabbed the extraction device, which had just reached 100%, and yanked it from the computer. The mission objective was secure. Now, she just had to survive long enough to deliver it. Sarah dove through the shattered window as bullets tore through the air around her. The 3-story drop should have been fatal, but she twisted her body mid-fall, using an awning on the second floor to break her momentum before crashing into a pile of supply crates below. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs, and for a moment Sarah lay still, wondering if she had broken anything important. Her shoulders screamed in agony, and her ribs felt bruised or possibly cracked. But she could move her limbs, which meant she could keep fighting. She forced herself to her feet and ran. Alarms were blaring across the entire base now. Searchlights swept the compound, looking for the intruder who had attacked their command center. Sarah pressed herself against the side of a building, trying to get her bearings. She was on the opposite side of the base from where her team was supposed to be waiting. Between her and the extraction point were hundreds of armed soldiers, multiple guard towers, and open ground that offered zero cover. Her radio crackled to life. Marcus's voice came through, urgent and concerned. The diversion had failed earlier than planned, and his team was taking heavy fire. They had extracted back to the rally point outside the base perimeter, but they were pinned down by enemy forces. He asked for Sarah's location and status. She could hear the unspoken question in his voice. "Are you still alive?" Sarah keyed her radio and gave her location. She told Marcus to prepare for extraction, but warned him she was on the wrong side of the base, with hostile forces between her position and theirs. Marcus wanted to send the team back in to get her, but Sarah refused. They had the mission objective, and that had to be protected. She would find her own way out. Before Marcus could argue, Sarah switched off her radio. She couldn't afford the distraction of her team trying to mount a rescue operation that would likely get them all killed. She was on her own, wounded, feverish, and surrounded by enemies. The smart play would be to find a place to hide until things calmed down, then try to slip out under cover of darkness. But Sarah had never been particularly good at playing it safe. She studied the layout of the base from her position. The motor pool was located about 200 yards from her current location. If she could reach it, she might be able to commandeer a vehicle and blast her way out. It was an insane plan with almost no chance of success, which made it exactly the kind of plan no one would expect. Sarah checked herself over quickly. She had no weapons besides a combat knife strapped to her leg. Her ammunition was gone, lost somewhere during the fall from the 3rd-story window. She was injured, sick, and exhausted. By every reasonable measure, she should be captured or killed within the next few minutes. Instead, she started running toward the motor pool. Soldiers spotted her immediately and opened fire. Sarah zigzagged between buildings, using every scrap of cover she could find. Bullets sparked off metal walls and kicked up dust around her feet. She could hear vehicles starting up behind her, beginning pursuit. The entire base was mobilizing to stop one wounded operative. Sarah reached the motor pool and dove behind a parked truck as a burst of automatic weapons. Fire chewed up the ground where she had been standing. She was breathing hard, and blood was still seeping from her shoulder wound. The extraction device felt heavy in her pocket, a reminder of why she was putting herself through this hell. Intelligence that could save countless lives. Intelligence that enemy forces would kill to keep secret. Asterisk. A guard appeared around the corner of the truck, his weapon raised. Sarah moved faster than should have been possible in her condition. Her combat knife flashed in the searchlights, and the guard dropped without making a sound. She took his rifle and spare magazines, finally giving herself a fighting chance. The motor pool contained dozens of vehicles. Sarah spotted what she needed immediately. A heavy armored personnel carrier sat idling near the gate, its crew having abandoned it to join the search for the intruder. It was designed to transport troops through hostile territory, which made it perfect for what Sarah had in mind. She sprinted to the vehicle and climbed into the driver's seat. The controls were foreign, but Sarah had trained on enough military vehicles to figure out the basics quickly. She threw the carrier into gear and stomped on the accelerator. The massive vehicle lurched forward, gaining speed rapidly. Sarah aimed it directly at the main gate, which was closed and heavily guarded. Guards scattered as they realized what was happening. Some tried to shoot out the tires, but the armored carrier's wheels were reinforced against exactly that kind of attack. Sarah gripped the wheel tightly, her knuckles white, as the gate loomed larger in her windshield. She was committed now. There was no turning back. The carrier smashed through the gate like it was made of paper. Metal screeched and tore, and then Sarah was through, racing into the desert beyond. Behind her, the entire base erupted into chaos. Vehicles poured through the destroyed gate in pursuit, and she could see muzzle flashes as soldiers fired at her retreating vehicle. But she was out, and she was still alive. Sarah grabbed her radio and called for extraction, giving her new heading. Marcus responded immediately, redirecting the team to intercept her. But the pursuit vehicles were gaining ground, and Sarah's captured carrier was starting to take damage from the concentrated fire. Warning lights were flashing on the dashboard, and the engine was making concerning noises. She pushed the vehicle harder, coaxing every bit of speed from it. The desert flew past in a blur. Her hands were steady on the wheel, despite the fever still raging through her body. The infection, the wounds, the exhaustion, none of it mattered now. She had the mission objective, and she would deliver it or die trying. The pursuit vehicles were closing in. Sarah could see them in her mirrors, at least a dozen trucks filled with armed soldiers. They were faster than her heavy carrier, and would overtake her soon. She needed an edge, something to slow them down and give her team time to reach her position. Her eyes fell on a button labeled in the foreign language, but the symbol next to it was universal. Smoke grenades. Sarah pressed the button, and the carrier's rear deployed a thick cloud of smoke that billowed across the desert behind her. The pursuit vehicles disappeared into the white fog, their drivers forced to slow down or risk collision. It bought her precious seconds, but it wasn't enough. She needed something more. That's when she saw Marcus and the team ahead, their vehicles forming a defensive line across her path. They weren't running anymore. They were preparing to fight. Sarah's heart sank. She had told them to extract, to protect themselves and the mission. Instead, they were here, ready to stand between her and an entire base worth of enemy soldiers. Nobody expected her to survive. Her team wasn't going to let her face death alone. Sarah's damaged carrier rumbled toward her team's position as the smoke screen began to dissipate behind her. She could see Marcus standing beside one of their vehicles, his rifle raised, ready to provide covering fire. The rest of the team had taken defensive positions, creating a corridor for her to drive through. They were outnumbered at least 20-1. They had chosen to stay and fight. She keyed her radio one more time and shouted at Marcus to fall back. They had the intelligence. Their job was to protect it, not throw their lives away trying to save one operative. Marcus's response was short and absolute. They weren't leaving without their captain. The discussion was over. The pursuit vehicles emerged from the smoke cloud like hunting wolves, their headlights cutting through the darkness. They spread out in a wide formation, attempting to flank Sarah's position and cut off any escape route. The base commander was clearly done playing games. He wanted that intelligence back, and he was willing to commit significant resources to retrieve it. Sarah's carrier sputtered as another. Warning light flashed red. The engine was dying. She had maybe another minute before the vehicle would be dead weight. She pushed it as hard as it would go, closing the distance to her team. 50 yards. 40 yards. The carrier's engine coughed and began losing power. 30 yards. 20 yards. Marcus and the team opened fire, their weapons lighting up the night. The concentrated firepower forced the pursuit vehicles to slow and take evasive action. It gave Sarah the seconds she needed. The carrier finally died completely, rolling to a stop just 10 yards from her team's position. Sarah grabbed the extraction device, kicked open the door, and ran. Bullets kicked up sand around her feet as she sprinted the final distance. Strong hands grabbed her and pulled her behind cover as return fire intensified. She collapsed against the wheel of a truck, her breathing ragged, blood still seeping from her shoulder wound. Marcus was shouting orders, coordinating their defense. But Sarah could barely hear him over the ringing in her ears. The extraction device was still secure in her pocket. That was all that mattered. She had completed the primary objective. Everything else was secondary. But looking at her team, at the soldiers who had stayed behind to save her, Sarah felt a weight settle on her chest that had nothing to do with her injuries. These people were here because of her. If they died tonight, their blood would be on her hands. The firefight intensified. The enemy had numbers and firepower on their side. Sarah's team had superior training and defensive positioning. It should have been enough to hold them off. But the enemy commander was smart. He wasn't charging into the defensive line. Instead, he was positioning his forces to surround them completely. Once they were encircled, it would only be a matter of time before they were overwhelmed. Sarah forced herself to focus through the fever and pain. They needed a way out, and they needed it fast. Their extraction vehicles could outrun the enemy trucks on open ground, but they had to break the encirclement first. And that would require a distraction big enough to create an opening. Her eyes fell on the abandoned carrier she had just escaped from. It was disabled but not destroyed. The fuel tank was probably still mostly full. If they could ignite it, the explosion would create chaos and cover for their escape. But someone would have to get close enough to set the charge. That person would be completely exposed to enemy fire. Sarah pushed herself to her feet, swaying slightly. Marcus noticed immediately and moved to stop her, but she waved him off. She explained her plan in short, clipped sentences. They would need to provide covering fire while she moved back to the carrier. Once she set the charge, they would have 30 seconds to get clear before the explosion. Marcus shook his head violently. Absolutely not. He would go. Sarah was in no condition to run, but Sarah was already moving. She grabbed a demolition charge from their supplies and checked its timer. The device was simple. Set the timer, activate it, and get away. She gave Marcus a look that stopped any further argument. This was her operation, her responsibility. She would see it through to the end. The team laid down suppressing fire, and Sarah ran. Her legs felt like lead, and each step sent jolts of pain through her injured shoulder. The carrier was only 30 yards away, but it felt like miles. Bullets whipped past her, so close she could feel the displacement of air. One round clipped her leg, sending her sprawling into the sand. For a moment, Sarah lay there, wondering if this was where it ended. The infection, the wounds, the exhaustion, it was all too much. Her body was shutting down, refusing to obey her commands. Through her fading vision, she could see the carrier just 10 yards away. So close, but impossibly far. Then she heard Marcus's voice over the radio, calling her name, telling her to get up, reminding her that the mission wasn't over, that they needed her. Sarah's fingers dug into the sand, and she pulled herself forward, 1 yard, then another. Her team's covering fire intensified, buying her precious seconds. She crawled the remaining distance to the carrier and used it. To pull herself upright, her hands shook as she attached the demolition charge to the fuel tank. The timer seemed to mock her fumbling fingers. Finally, she managed to set it for 30 seconds and activate it. The soft beeping sound started, counting down to destruction. Sarah turned and tried to run back to her team. She made it 5 steps before her legs gave out completely. She hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from her lungs. 20 seconds. Sarah tried to get up, but her body refused to respond. The fever had reached critical levels, and combined with blood loss and exhaustion, her system was finally giving up. 15 seconds. Marcus appeared beside her, seemingly out of nowhere. He grabbed her and threw her over his shoulder in a fireman's carry, running full speed back toward their defensive position. Sarah tried to protest, tried to tell him to save himself, but no words would come. 10 seconds. Marcus ran faster than Sarah had ever seen anyone move while carrying a full-grown person. They dove behind cover just as the carrier exploded. The blast was enormous, a rolling ball of fire that lit up the desert like daylight. The shockwave rattled their vehicles and sent debris flying in all directions. Several of the pursuing vehicles were caught in the explosion, flipping end over end from the force of the blast. Chaos erupted among the enemy forces. The carefully coordinated encirclement dissolved as units scrambled to avoid the burning wreckage and help their wounded. This was the opening Sarah's team needed. Marcus was already shouting orders. They loaded into their vehicles, engines roaring to life. Sarah was placed in the back of the lead vehicle, someone pressing bandages against her wounds. The team punched through the disorganized enemy line, their vehicles racing into the open desert. Pursuit was scattered and disorganized now. Enemy commander had lost control of his forces in the chaos of the explosion. By the time they regrouped, Sarah's team would be miles away, disappearing into the vast emptiness of the desert. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness during the drive. She was vaguely aware of someone working on her shoulder wound, of voices discussing her fever, of the vehicle bouncing over rough terrain. The extraction device was taken from her pocket, secured in a protective case. The mission objective was safe. That knowledge allowed her to finally let go, to stop fighting the darkness that had been pulling at her for hours. When she awoke, Sarah found herself in a medical tent. Bright lights overhead made her squint. An IV was attached to her arm, pumping fluids and antibiotics into her system. Her shoulder was bandaged professionally, and the fever seemed to have broken. She tried to sit up, but found she lacked the strength. Marcus appeared beside her bed, looking exhausted but relieved. He told her they had made it to the extraction point and been airlifted out 6 hours ago. She had been unconscious for most of that time while the medical team worked to stabilize her. The infection had been severe, much worse than she had let anyone know. She had been hours away from sepsis when they got her to proper medical care. Sarah asked about the team. Everyone had made it out alive, though several were injured. The casualties could have been much worse. Marcus didn't say what they both knew. Sarah had died in that carrier, or if she had been captured. Or if she had failed to get that intelligence, then all those risks and injuries would have been for nothing. The team had gambled everything on her ability to complete the mission against impossible odds. The extraction device sat on a table beside her bed. Marcus explained that the intelligence it contained was even more valuable than they had anticipated. The weapons dealer wasn't just supplying conventional arms. He had been providing advanced technology, including weapons system designs that could shift the balance of power in the region. The information Sarah had extracted would allow their forces to counter these weapons and potentially track down the entire supply network. In other words, Sarah's stubborn refusal to quit, her decision to continue the mission while fighting a severe infection, her willingness to put herself in mortal danger repeatedly, had potentially saved thousands of lives. The mission had been a success, but barely. Any number of things could have gone wrong, should have gone wrong. Sarah closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling at her again. She mumbled something about needing to debrief the command staff. Marcus told her that could wait. Right now, she needed to rest and recover. The base had been thrown into complete chaos by her escape. Enemy forces were still trying to figure out exactly what had happened. As Sarah drifted back towards sleep, she heard other voices in the tent. Team members coming to check on their captain, expressing relief that she was alive. Telling stories about the mission that were already becoming legend. The operative who infiltrated a hostile base while fighting a life-threatening infection, who survived being trapped by enemies, fell 3 stories, stole a vehicle, and turned an entire military installation into a war zone, who nobody expected to survive, but somehow did anyway. But Sarah knew the truth. She hadn't survived through skill alone or even luck. She had survived because her team refused to abandon her, because Marcus had risked his own life to pull her clear of that explosion, because 12 operatives had chosen to stand and fight against overwhelming odds rather than leave one of their own behind. The success of the mission would be recorded in official reports. The intelligence gained would be analyzed and acted upon. But what would stay with Sarah? What would matter more than any commendation or recognition was the knowledge that she hadn't faced those impossible odds alone. Her team had been there, standing between her and certain death, refusing to accept that she couldn't survive. Outside the medical tent, The sun was rising over the desert. The team was safe. The mission was complete. And Sarah was alive against all expectations. But the story wasn't quite over yet. The chaos she had created at that base was still unfolding. Enemy forces were scrambling to understand what had happened and how one operative had caused so much destruction. Marcus sat beside Sarah's bed, reviewing reports on his tablet. Security footage from the base had been leaked by an intelligence asset. It showed Sarah's escape in detail. Command center breach, the 3-story fall, the stolen carrier, the explosive breakthrough. The footage was spreading through enemy communication channels, creating confusion and fear. One soldier had done all that? How many more were involved? What other attacks were planned? The psychological impact was almost as valuable as the intelligence itself. The base commander had been relieved of duty for allowing the breach. Trust between the weapons dealer and his clients had been shattered. Security protocols were being completely overhauled, which would slow their operations for months. And all because Sarah had refused to quit, had turned what should have been certain death into victory. Sarah stirred again, her eyes opening. The antibiotics were working, and her strength was slowly returning. She looked at Marcus and asked the question that had been bothering her since she woke up. How had the mission been compromised? The weapons dealer had been waiting for them. He had known they were coming. Marcus's expression darkened. That was the question intelligence was trying to answer. Someone had leaked their operational plans. Timing had been too precise. The dealer's preparation too thorough for it to be coincidence. There was a mole somewhere in their organization, someone feeding information to the enemy. The investigation was ongoing. Sarah processed this information with growing anger. Her team had been sent into a trap. It walked into that base, expecting a quick extraction but found a full military response instead. People could have died because someone had betrayed them. She swore that once she recovered, she would find whoever was responsible, but that was a problem for tomorrow. Right now, Sarah needed to focus on healing. The doctors had told her she would need weeks to fully recover from the infection and her injuries. Weeks of sitting in hospital beds and going through physical therapy while her team was out there, still at risk from whoever had compromised their mission. Sarah hated the idea of being sidelined, but she knew she had pushed her body beyond its limits during the mission. If she tried to return to duty too soon, she would only put her team at greater risk. So she would rest, she would heal, and she would prepare for whatever came next. Because if there was one thing the mission had proven, it was that Sarah Chen didn't know how to quit. News of the mission was spreading through the military community. Other operators were hearing about the woman who had turned a compromised mission into a stunning success, who had fought through a hostile base while suffering from a severe infection, who had single-handedly created enough chaos to allow her entire team to escape. The story was already taking on legendary proportions, but Sarah didn't care about the legend or the recognition. She cared about the 12 people who had stood with her against impossible odds. The team members who had refused to abandon their captain, even when doing so was the logical choice. Marcus, who had carried her away from that explosion when she couldn't walk. These were the people who mattered. These were the people she had fought so hard to protect. The mission had been a success by any objective measure. Intelligence secured, team extracted, enemy operations disrupted. But it had also been a stark reminder of how quickly things could go wrong in their line of work. One compromised mission, one leak, one moment of bad luck, and everything could have ended very differently. Sarah closed her eyes and let herself rest. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new missions. But tonight she was alive, her team was safe, and the intelligence that had cost so much to obtain would be put to good use. Sometimes that had to be enough. Sometimes survival itself was the victory. In the darkness behind her closed eyes, Sarah could still see the burning carrier, still feel the impact of bullets passing too close, still hear Marcus's voice calling her name. The memories would fade with time, but they would never completely disappear. Every mission left its mark, every near-death experience added another layer to the weight operators carried. This was the price of the work they did, the burden they accepted in service of something larger than themselves. The base she had turned into a war zone was still dealing with the aftermath of her attack. Reports indicated complete confusion among enemy forces. Security measures had been tripled, but the damage to morale and operational effectiveness was already done. One person had proven that their supposedly secure installation could be infiltrated and their most valuable assets extracted. The psychological blow was devastating. None of that mattered to Sarah as she lay in the medical tent, fighting to regain her strength. What mattered was that she had kept her word. She had completed the mission she had spent 6 months planning. She had protected her team to the best of her ability. And when everything went wrong, when the mission was compromised, and survival seemed impossible, she had adapted and overcome. 3 weeks had passed since the mission. Sarah sat in a secure briefing room at headquarters, her arm still in a sling, but otherwise recovered. The infection was gone, the bullet wound healing properly, and her strength had returned enough for light duty. Around the table sat senior intelligence officers, mission commanders, and Marcus, who had been called in to provide his perspective on what had happened. The intelligence Sarah had extracted was spread across multiple screens on the walls. Weapons schematics, financial transactions, communication logs, and a network of contacts that stretched across multiple countries. It was more comprehensive than anyone had hoped. The weapons dealer had kept detailed records of everything. Probably never imagining someone would breach his supposedly secure base and steal it all. A senior officer began the debriefing by acknowledging what everyone already knew. The mission should have been a failure. The intelligence indicating a lightly defended outpost had been deliberately falsified. The weapons dealer had known an operation was being planned and had prepared a trap. By all reasonable expectations, Sarah and her team should have been captured or killed. Instead, it turned the trap into an opportunity. Sarah's adaptation to the changed circumstances, her willingness to take enormous personal risks, and her team's unwavering support had resulted in not just mission success, but an intelligence windfall that was already bearing fruit. 3 weapons supply lines had been shut down. 2 terrorist cells had been neutralized. And the weapons dealer himself, whose reputation had been built on being untouchable, was now on the run. But the briefing wasn't just about celebrating success. It was about understanding how the mission had been compromised and ensuring it never happened again. The investigation had been thorough and had uncovered some disturbing truths. The leak had come from inside their own organization, from someone with access to mission planning documents. Sarah listened as the details were laid out. A junior analyst who had been working at headquarters for 2 years had been recruited by enemy intelligence. He had been feeding them information about planned operations, including Sarah's mission to capture the weapons dealer. The analyst had believed he was helping prevent conflicts by giving enemies advance warning. In reality, he had been putting operatives in mortal danger and undermining critical operations. The analyst had been arrested 3 days ago. His handler, the enemy intelligence officer who had recruited him, had been identified through the communications logs Sarah had extracted. The network was being systematically dismantled, but the damage had been done. How many other missions had been compromised? How many other teams had walked into traps because someone they trusted had betrayed them? Sarah felt anger rising in her chest. The analyst's naive beliefs about preventing conflicts had nearly gotten her entire team killed. She had fought through a life-threatening infection, survived a 3-story fall, and turned a military base into chaos because someone in a comfortable office somewhere had decided to play both sides. The irony wasn't lost on her. Marcus spoke up, his voice controlled, but carrying an edge of barely suppressed rage. He pointed out that if the leak had been discovered sooner, they could have used it to feed false information to the enemy. Instead, they had unknowingly walked into a prepared ambush. Only Sarah's refusal to abort the mission when the true situation became clear had salvaged anything from the disaster. The senior officer acknowledged this and revealed something new. The decision to proceed with the mission despite the compromised intelligence was now being studied as a case example. Sarah's ability to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances, to turn disadvantages into advantages, and to maintain mission focus while dealing with severe personal health issues was being analyzed for training purposes. Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She didn't want to be a case study or an example. She had done what needed to be done to complete her mission and protect her team. The fact that it had worked out didn't mean it was a template for future operations. She had gotten lucky, pure and simple. In another timeline, she would have been captured or killed in that command center. But the intelligence officers saw it differently. They pointed to specific decisions Sarah had made. The choice to use the maintenance shaft instead of forcing entry through guarded doors, the decision to use herself as bait to keep the weapons dealer from escaping. The stolen carrier, an explosive breach. Each decision had been risky, but calculated, turning the enemy's superior numbers and preparation against them. The conversation shifted to the psychological impact of the mission. Enemy forces were still trying to understand what had happened. The security footage that had been leaked showed one operative causing chaos that a full assault team would have struggled to achieve. Morale at the base had collapsed. Several officers had resigned rather than face potential disciplinary action for failing to stop one intruder. More importantly, the weapons dealer's clients were reconsidering their relationships with him. If he couldn't protect his own base and intelligence, how could he be trusted to supply weapons reliably? His entire business model was built on being able to operate securely, and Sarah had shattered that illusion in one night. The ripple effects were still unfolding. Intelligence analysts brought up satellite imagery from the base taken 2 days ago. The command center Sarah had breached was being demolished. The motor pool had been relocated. Guard tower positions had been completely redesigned. The entire base was being rebuilt from the ground up because of security vulnerabilities one operative had exploited. The cost in time and resources was staggering. Sarah listened to all of this with mixed feelings. Yes, the mission had been successful. Yes, the intelligence was valuable. Yes, the disruption to enemy operations was significant. But she kept thinking about those moments in the command center when she had been surrounded, feverish and wounded, with no clear path to survival. She kept remembering the sound of Marcus's voice over the radio, refusing to abandon her. The choice her team had made to stay and fight, when the smart move was to retreat. The briefing concluded with commendations being announced. Sarah and her team would receive recognition for their actions, though the details would remain classified. There would be no public acknowledgement, no medals ceremony, no press coverage, just quiet recognition from people who understood what had actually happened and what it meant. After the briefing ended, Sarah remained in the room as others filed out. Marcus stayed as well, knowing she would want to talk. They sat in silence for a moment, both processing everything they had just heard. Finally, Sarah spoke. She thanked Marcus for pulling her clear of that explosion, for refusing to leave her behind, for making the choice that had saved her life. Marcus shrugged, looking uncomfortable with the gratitude. He pointed out that Sarah had done the same for others countless times. That was what teams did. They protected each other, even when the cost was high. Especially when the cost was high. Leaving someone behind was never an option, regardless of what the tactical situation dictated. Sarah nodded slowly. She understood that philosophy intellectually had always believed in it, but experiencing it from the other side had given her a new perspective. She had been the one who needed saving, who had been too injured and sick to save herself. That vulnerability had been difficult to accept, even now. The conversation turned to the future. The compromised analyst had been caught, but there were concerns about other potential leaks. Security protocols were being overhauled across the organization. Missions would be planned with tighter information control. Teams would operate with less advance notice to reduce the window for intelligence to be leaked. It would make their jobs harder, but potentially safer. Sarah asked about the team. How were they handling the aftermath of the mission? Marcus reported that everyone was recovering well physically. Psychologically, there were some challenges. The knowledge that they had been sent into a trap, that someone had betrayed them, was affecting morale. But the successful outcome and the value of the intelligence they had extracted was helping. They had won despite the betrayal, and that meant something. Marcus also mentioned that the team had been asking when Sarah would return to full duty. They wanted their captain back, wanted to know when they would be operating together again. Sarah appreciated the sentiment, but knew she needed more time. The doctors had cleared her for light duty, but field operations required being at 100%. Anything less put the entire team at risk. She thought about that night in the desert, about the moment when her body had finally given out, and she had collapsed trying to run from the exploding carrier. If Marcus hadn't been there, she would have died in that blast. Her determination and willpower had pushed her beyond reasonable limits. But ultimately, her body had reached a breaking point. She couldn't let that happen again. The weeks of recovery had given Sarah time to reflect on her approach to missions. She had always pushed herself hard, had always been willing to take personal risks to ensure mission success. That dedication had served her well, but it had also nearly killed her. Going into that mission while fighting a severe infection had been a calculated risk that had almost ended in disaster. Marcus seemed to read her thoughts. He pointed out that while Sarah's decision to proceed with the mission despite being sick had worked out, it was also reckless. If she had been captured, the infection alone might have killed her before enemy forces could interrogate her. The mission objective would have been lost, and the team would have lost their captain. It had been a gamble with enormous stakes. Sarah didn't disagree. She admitted that if she faced the same decision again, she wasn't sure she would make a different choice. The mission had been 6 months in the making. Postponing it would have meant starting the intelligence gathering process over from scratch, assuming the weapons dealer hadn't already relocated. Sometimes there were no good options, only choices between different kinds of risk. They talked about the weapons dealer himself. Intelligence indicated he had gone into hiding after the base breach. His reputation was damaged, but he wasn't finished. Men like him always had contingency plans and backup resources. He would eventually resurface, probably somewhere unexpected, and continue his business. This wasn't over. Sarah felt a grim satisfaction knowing that the dealer would be looking over his shoulder for the rest of his life. He had thought himself untouchable, had prepared an elaborate trap for her team, and had still lost everything. The security footage showed him diving for cover as Sarah had breached his office. That image of his fear and panic was worth all the pain and struggle of the mission. The intelligence officers had asked Sarah to review the weapons dealer's files in detail, looking for connections and patterns that might not be obvious to analysts who hadn't been on the ground. She had agreed, knowing that her unique perspective might reveal something important. It would also give her something productive to do while she finished recovering. Marcus stood to leave, mentioning he needed to check on the rest of the team. Before he left, he turned back to Sarah. He told her that what she had done at that base, the way she had turned a disaster into victory, had earned more than just official commendations. It had earned the kind of respect that couldn't be given by commanders or listed in personnel files. The kind that came from people who had seen what she was capable of when everything was on the line. After Marcus left, Sarah remained in the briefing room, studying the intelligence displayed on the screens. Faces, locations, transactions, all connected in a web that spread across continents. This was what she had risked everything to obtain. These were the threads that, when pulled, would unravel enemy operations and save lives. The mission had been worth it. But Sarah knew she couldn't keep pushing herself to the breaking point on every operation. There had to be a balance between dedication and self-preservation. She had been lucky this time. Marcus had been there to pull her clear of the explosion. The team had been there to fight off pursuers. The stolen carrier had lasted just long enough to reach friendly lines. Any of those factors could have gone differently. She thought about the title people were already using for the mission report, "The operative nobody expected to survive." It was accurate, if somewhat dramatic. By every reasonable measure, she should have died in that command center, or during the escape, or from the infection that had been ravaging her body. Instead, she had survived and succeeded. Sarah pulled up the security footage from the base on one of the screens. She watched herself moving through the compound, stealing the carrier, smashing through the gate. From this external perspective, her actions looked almost superhuman. No hesitation, no fear visible, just pure determination driving every movement. It was strange seeing herself that way. The footage also showed the aftermath of her escape. Guards running in confusion, officers shouting contradictory orders, the entire base in chaos. She had been one person against hundreds, and yet she had been the one who controlled the situation. Not through superior firepower or numbers, but through unpredictability and sheer audacity. A message notification appeared on her tablet. The analysts had found something in the communications logs. A scheduled meeting between the weapons dealer and a new client, set to take place in 3 weeks at a location that had been encrypted in the files. With the decryption keys Sarah had extracted, they now knew when and where. It was an opportunity for another operation. Sarah read the details carefully. This would be a chance to capture not just the dealer, but also identify his remaining clients. It could be the operation that finally ended his arms trafficking network permanently. But it would require careful planning and a team capable of handling what was sure to be a heavily defended meeting location. She thought about whether she would be ready to participate in 3 weeks. The doctors would probably clear her by then, assuming no complications with her recovery. Her team would want her there. This was, after all, her case. She had built the intelligence network that led them to the dealer. She had extracted the information now being used to plan the next operation. But Sarah also remembered collapsing in the desert, remembered the feeling of her body simply refusing to continue. She remembered the fever dreams during recovery and the doctors explaining how close she had come to septic shock. Going into another higher-risk operation, while not fully recovered, would be repeating the same mistake that had nearly killed her. The mission would go forward with or without her. Marcus was fully capable of leading the team. They had proven during the extraction that they could handle extreme situations and still succeed. Sarah would provide intelligence, support, and operational planning. But she would do it from headquarters rather than the field. It was a difficult decision to accept. Sarah had always led from the front, had always been the first through the door. Sitting on the sidelines while her team went into danger felt wrong. But it was the right choice. The mission was bigger than her ego or her need to be involved in every operation. She sent a message to Marcus outlining her thoughts. The next operation would be his to lead. She would provide all the support she could from headquarters, but the tactical decisions would be his responsibility. She trusted him completely and knew the team was in good hands. The response came back quickly. Marcus understood her reasoning and accepted the responsibility. He also promised that they would bring the weapons dealer back in handcuffs and let Sarah be the one to interrogate him. After everything she had been through, she had earned that right. Sarah smiled at that. The idea of sitting across from the dealer, the man who had prepared a trap for her team, and calmly asking him questions while he sat in chains had a certain appeal. He would know exactly who she was. The operative who had breached his secure base, stolen his intelligence, and destroyed his reputation. That knowledge would make the interrogation all the more satisfying. Over the following days, Sarah threw herself into mission planning. She analyzed every detail of the communications logs, built profiles of potential clients, and identified security vulnerabilities at the meeting location. If Marcus and the team were going to execute this operation, they would go in with every advantage she could provide. The base she had turned into a war zone was now a case study being taught at training facilities. New operatives were learning about adaptive tactics, about turning enemy strengths into weaknesses, about maintaining mission focus under extreme duress. Sarah had received requests to participate in the training program, to explain her decision-making process during the mission. She declined. The last thing she wanted was to stand in front of classrooms full of young operatives and make what had been a desperate struggle for survival sound like a planned, tactical approach. The mission had been a series of improvised responses to an impossible situation. Yes, training and experience had guided those responses, but it hadn't been some brilliant strategy. It had been survival. Marcus brought the team to headquarters for mission planning sessions. Seeing them again, healthy and ready for action, reinforced Sarah's decision to sit this one out. They were sharp, focused, and confident. The previous mission hadn't broken them. If anything, it had made them stronger, more cohesive as a unit. They trusted each other completely, and that trust would be crucial in the coming operation. During one planning session, the team members shared their perspectives on the previous mission. Each had a different view of what had happened, seeing different parts of the larger picture. Together, their accounts painted a comprehensive picture of the chaos Sarah had created at that base. It was humbling to hear them describe her actions with such respect. One team member brought up the moment when Sarah had fallen during her escape from the command center and Marcus had carried her clear of the explosion. He mentioned that several team members had wanted to go back in to help, but Marcus had ordered them to maintain the defensive position. It had been the right call tactically, but emotionally difficult to watch their captain in danger. Sarah realized then how much weight her team had been carrying. They had been watching their captain push herself beyond reasonable limits, had seen her struggling with injury and illness, and had been unable to do anything except trust that she would pull through. That must have been incredibly difficult, perhaps harder than the fighting itself. She made a mental note to address this in future operations. Teams needed to know their leaders were taking care of themselves, not just sacrificing personal well-being for mission success. The line between dedication and self-destruction was thinner than she had realized, and crossing it affected more than just the individual. The planning sessions concluded with a solid operational plan. Marcus would lead the team to intercept the weapons dealer at his meeting location. They would capture the dealer and any clients present, then extract with the prisoners for interrogation. It was straightforward, with contingencies built in for likely complications. Sarah was confident in the plan and in Marcus's ability to execute it. 2 days before the operation was scheduled to launch, Sarah received unexpected news. The weapons dealer had been spotted entering a different country, nowhere near the planned meeting location. Either the meeting had been moved, or the communications logs had contained deliberate misinformation designed to mislead anyone who breached his security. This changed everything. The careful planning, the detailed analysis, all of it might be based on false information. Sarah reviewed the communications logs again, looking for signs of deception. The more she examined them, the more she realized the dealer had been smarter than she had given him credit for. He had layered truth with lies, making it nearly impossible to determine which information was real. Marcus suggested they abort the operation until better intelligence could be developed. Sarah disagreed. The dealer knew his base had been breached and his files compromised. He would be changing locations, identities, and methods constantly now. If they waited for perfect intelligence, they might never get another chance. Instead, Sarah proposed a different approach. They would proceed with the original plan, but treat it as a potential trap. If the meeting location was legitimate, they would execute as planned. If it was a setup, they would be ready to adapt, just as they had during the previous mission. It was risky, but calculated risk was part of their profession. The decision was made to proceed. Marcus and the team would deploy as planned, with heightened security measures and escape routes prepared in advance. Sarah would monitor the operation from headquarters, providing real-time intelligence support and coordinating backup resources if needed. As the team prepared to deploy, Sarah gathered them for a final briefing. She looked at each face, these people who had stood with her against impossible odds. She told them that this operation was different from the last. They were going in, eyes open, knowing the intelligence might be compromised. But they were also going in stronger, more experienced, and more prepared than before. She reminded them that the mission objective was valuable, but not worth their lives. If things went wrong, if it became another trap, they had permission to extract immediately. There would be other opportunities, other operations. What mattered was that they came home safely. Marcus nodded his understanding. The team looked determined, but not reckless. They had learned from the previous mission, had felt the consequences of compromised intelligence. They wouldn't walk blindly into danger again, but they also weren't going to let fear of traps paralyze them. Sometimes the only way forward was through. The operation launched on schedule. Sarah watched from the operations center as the team deployed to the meeting location. Hours passed with routine status updates. Then the call came that contact had been made. The weapons dealer was at the location, along with 3 clients. The meeting was legitimate after all. Sarah listened as Marcus coordinated the capture operation. It went smoothly, with the dealer and his clients detained before they could react. No shots fired, no casualties, a textbook execution. Within 30 minutes, the team was extracted with their prisoners, heading back to friendly territory for interrogation. Relief washed over Sarah. The mission had been a success, and everyone was safe. The weapons dealer was finally in custody. His network would be dismantled. The intelligence Sarah had extracted would would be used to prevent future arms trafficking. The chaos she had created at that base weeks ago had led directly to this moment. When the team returned to headquarters, Sarah was waiting. She watched as the prisoners were led away to secure holding facilities. The weapons dealer looked diminished somehow, no longer the confident businessman who had prepared a trap for her team. He was just another criminal facing justice for his actions. Marcus approached with a tired smile. Mission accomplished. Sarah congratulated him and the team, genuinely proud of how they had handled the operation. They had gone in, prepared, adapted to the actual situation they found, and executed flawlessly. It was everything she could have asked for. Later that evening, Sarah finally got her chance to interrogate the weapons dealer. She sat across from him in a secure room, her arm still in its sling, a visible reminder of their previous encounter. The dealer recognized her immediately. His expression showed a mixture of fear and grudging respect. Sarah began with a simple question. She asked him if he understood that nobody had expected her to survive that night at his base. The dealer nodded slowly. He admitted that when his guards had cornered her in his office, he had been certain she would be captured or killed. What happened instead, her escape and the chaos that followed, had been beyond anything he had prepared for. She asked him about the trap, about how he had known her team was coming. The dealer explained that the compromised analyst had provided detailed information about the operation. He had turned his base into a fortress, specifically to capture Sarah and her team. The intelligence he would have gained from interrogating them would have been invaluable to his clients. But one thing he hadn't accounted for was Sarah's refusal to quit. Her willingness to push beyond reasonable limits, to take risks that no rational person would accept. That had been the flaw in his perfect trap. He had prepared for skilled operators following doctrine. Sarah had thrown doctrine out the window and improvised her way through every obstacle. The interrogation continued for hours. The dealer provided information about his network, his clients, and his operations. Some of it corroborated the intelligence Sarah had extracted. Some of it was new. By the time they finished, intelligence had enough information to roll up the entire arms trafficking network across multiple countries. As guards led the dealer away to his cell, he turned back to Sarah. He told her that in all his years, he had never encountered anyone like her. Someone who could turn certain defeat into victory through sheer determination and adaptability. It was the closest thing to a compliment he could offer. Sarah watched him go, feeling a sense of closure. The mission that had nearly killed her had finally reached its conclusion. The weapons dealer was in custody, his network was being dismantled, and the threat he represented was neutralized. All the pain, the risk, the struggle had been worth it. She left the interrogation room and found Marcus waiting in the hallway. Together, they walked through headquarters, neither speaking, both processing everything that had happened over the past weeks. The mission, the betrayal, the recovery, the final capture. It had been a journey neither would forget. Marcus finally broke the silence. He mentioned that the story of Sarah turning the base into a war zone was spreading beyond their organization. Other agencies were hearing about it, asking questions. Sarah's name was becoming known in intelligence circles as someone who could succeed against impossible odds. Sarah wasn't sure how she felt about that reputation. Fame wasn't something she had ever sought. She was an operative, not a celebrity. Her job was to complete missions and protect her team, not to build a legend. But she also understood that reputation could be a tool, something that could be used to intimidate enemies and inspire allies. They reached the exit, stepping out into the cool night air. Sarah looked up at the stars, thinking about that night in the desert when she'd been running for her life. How different everything looked now, with the mission complete and justice served. She had survived against all expectations, turned defeat into victory, and proven that determination could overcome even the most carefully laid traps. Marcus asked what she would do next. Sarah smiled. She would heal completely, rejoin her team full-time, and prepare for whatever mission came after this. Because this was what she did. This was who she was. An operative who refused to quit, who turned impossible situations into opportunities, who would stand with her team against any threat.